You've advertised me on your leaflet as a long-standing anti-war activist, and that's true. The first anti-war activity I can remember being is the organiser of Youth Against the War in the first Iraq War in Britain, so that's a long time ago. But that's a reflection of the fact I'm a socialist. All genuine socialists are opposed to the kind of brutal imperialist carnage that we can see taking place today. I'm sure all of you are looking on in horror at what is taking place in the Ukraine, and you don't need me to describe the millions who fled the country, the bombardment of cities being reduced to rubble, the killing of children, all of the rest of it. You've seen it on your TV screens. And farcically, of course, Putin is still claiming that this is not an invasion, but a special military operation designed to deal with Ukrainian fascism. Let's be clear, it's nonsense and he knows it. And the far right that exists in the Ukraine, and also exists in Russia, will only be strengthened by what is taking place with this invasion. This is an attempt to trample over Ukraine in order to try and assert the power of Russian capitalism and to warn US imperialism and the Western capitalist powers generally not to come any further east. And we would have to say this horrific war is the inevitable consequence of an economic system we live under, which is based on profit, exploitation and oppression, where the rights of weaker nations are trampled into the dirt by the so-called great powers, including the US and also Britain, when it suits their interest to do so. And somewhere like Ukraine, which has the misfortune to be historically on the borders between great powers, has suffered from this again and again. The press in Britain, and I'm sure this is true in America as well, kind of try and say, well, Putin's crazy. And the most right-wing say all Russians are crazy as an explanation for the war. Let's be clear, these are criminal actions, they're horrific, they will also prove to be a huge miscalculation because they will not strengthen Russian capitalism or the Putin regime, they will actually undermine and probably eventually finish Putin's regime. But they flow from the logic of capitalism. Frankly, they are mad in the same way that US President George Bush was mad, and the Labour government in my country who backed up George Bush when they invaded Iraq. Let's remember, or for some of you, you weren't old enough to remember, so let me say it, that at the time, they claimed they were going in to stop the far-right Islamists of Al-Qaeda. They did not exist in Iraq before the invasion. They did afterwards. And they claimed they were going in against weapons of mass destruction, which they knew full well did not exist in Iraq at that point in time. Really, it was the hubris, the overconfidence of US imperialism, of Bush at that point in time, that they thought it would show the dominance of the US and provide the US with cheap oil. And of course, in fact, it was part of undermining the power of US imperialism, a process that has continued since, just as this invasion will undermine Putin. Of course, it's not going to undermine him soon enough. It's true that he's made a significant military miscalculation. We're not in the internal discussions of Putin and the clique around him, but it seems pretty clear that they wrongly thought they would get an easy or relatively easy victory when they invaded Ukraine. And instead that has not taken place, and so they've stepped up the horror, they've stepped up the bombardment, they've reorganised and are now concentrating on trying to take absolute control in a part of the East. And there is no doubt that within the Russian state, within the elite, there are big elements who are looking at these blunders and thinking, we should get rid of Putin. And a kind of internal palace coup, one bit of the regime getting rid of another bit of the regime, is certainly something that could happen. But unfortunately, not in the immediate term. Because once a capitalist class, a capitalist government goes to war, their prestige is on the line. And therefore they have to be able to chalk up something they can call a victory in order to be able to then deal with the politicians or and so on that have made the mistake. Nonetheless, at some stage they could well act against Putin. And let's be clear, that will not be out of humanitarian reasons. They have overseen the vicious wars in Chechnya. Just recently, they have not complained when Russian troops went in and shot unarmed demonstrators in Kazakhstan in the movement that was taking place there, which supporters of the CWI were involved in and reported directly to us on. If elements of the regime at some stage move against Putin, it will be because they see how catastrophic this invasion has been for Russian capitalism, but also because they face growing opposition from the Russian working class, from ordinary people in Russia. And that's what we've got to remember. What force can stop Putin's gangster regime? And the answer is the Russian working class. They have the power to do it. We've seen examples already, not in Russia but in Belarus, of workers refusing or sabotaging on the railroads, troops and equipment getting over the border to take part in the invasion of Ukraine. And let's be clear, it's true, right now, what is really happening in Ukraine is not being shown on Russian TV screens at all. Just as, by the way, we were not shown what was really happening in Baghdad. Those of you who are old enough to remember will remember we were told they found these marvellous missiles which never hit civilians. They just find their way directly to the military targets. Baghdad was bombed for 30 nights before the troops went in, and there were undoubtedly many civilians that were killed in the course of that, but it was not shown on our TV screens. Nor, of course, is what's happening in the Yemen at the moment shown on our TV screens. 10,000 children have been killed. 30 million are facing starvation in that war, and Biden has just agreed a further 650 million arms deal with the Saudi regime, which is prosecuting that war against unarmed people and civilians in the Yemen. But pointing out the bias of our own capitalist media does not mean that we're suggesting that the Russian capitalist media is any less biased. It is absolutely clear they are being told lies on their TV screens, and right now there probably is a majority of the Russian population who are in favour of the war. Unfortunately, at the start of a war, it is usually the case that a capitalist elite can whip up their own population behind the war that is taking place. Last reference to Iraq, but that was true then, actually.
Absolutely.
Certainly in Britain before the war, a majority of the population were opposed to it. Around the world, there were massive demonstrations against it. But once the war started, the idea we have to back our boys, that was understandably very strong and was cynically used by the capitalist class in order to whip up their population. But having said that, even now, despite the press blackout in Russia, despite that inevitable feeling that you've got to support your own troops, and despite gigantic repression, there have been a lot of demonstrations against the war taking place in Russia. More than 50 cities have had big protests. More than 15,000 people have been arrested. And it's worse being arrested in Russia than it is. I know it's not great being arrested in the US, but it's worse being arrested in Russia, and they've done that and they've gone out and had the courage to protest. I read an example of women in Siberia. Not people you would expect to normally be protesting against a war, because they were the wives and mothers of riot police. So, you know, not normally the friends of socialists. But they had a big angry protest against the Siberian governor because their husbands and sons were sent on a supposed training exercise which was actually being sent to intervene in the war in the Ukraine. These are police, not soldiers. And as a result, we're dying, and they're saying you're using us as cannon fodder, etc., etc. So that mood is already developing in Russia at this point in time, and will grow, because unfortunately there are already big losses on both sides, but including of Russian troops taking place in the war, and also there are big links between the Russian and Ukrainian population. People have relatives and friends over the border. That means it's just not possible to keep the lies going about what is really taking place. Okay, as socialists, we're clear. Capitalism is a system based on the drive for profit by a few big corporations, who, by the way, at the moment are saying, oh, we've got to put our prices up because of the Ukrainian war to maximise our profits. In Britain, our gas prices, that's the energy in our houses that we cook with and so on, is at the highest ever level. Our gas comes from the North Sea. It's got nothing to do with the Ukraine. They just shove the prices up because they can make bigger profits because the world prices have gone up in the course of the war. But it's a system based on profit, but also based on nation states that are increasingly in competition with each other. The brief era where US imperialism was so powerful it really could tell the rest of the world what to do, that's over. It's the biggest power, but it's declining. And increasingly we are seeing conflicts between these different capitalist powers. And so wars are a product of capitalism. And that's why we fight for a socialist society. We say power should be taken out of the hands of these tiny number of corporations and capitalist governments. We should have a socialist society where ordinary working class people run and plan society democratically, and that in the long term is how you are going to cut across war. By the way, it's not a coincidence that before he went and invaded Ukraine, Putin, who some of the most right-wing press appallingly suggests is a socialist, he bears no resemblance to socialism, he's a gangster capitalist, he attacked Lenin, one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, and argued that Lenin had been completely wrong because he stood for the right, as did the Bolsheviks when working class people took power in 1917 in Russia, for the right of the Ukrainians and all minorities to self-determination, for freedom. So, Putin attacked socialist ideas when he justified his invasion. And you don't have to believe me. Today I just read an article in the Financial Times, which is the main party of big business in Britain. It is not a socialist newspaper. And they say the Soviet Communist Party in the 1920s were in no doubt that Ukrainians were a nation distinct from Russians. They adopted a policy of Ukrainianization, under which the state supported Ukrainian education, culture and language, and promoted Ukrainians to big administrative posts. So there you go. The only time that the Ukrainian people began to get genuine self-determination was when working class people took power in Russia back then. Of course, that was a very brief period, because the Soviet Union degenerated. It became a brutal dictatorship, still based on a kind of planned economy, but a brutal dictatorship in which the Ukrainians suffered again terribly, as did all national minorities. And then when those dictatorships finally collapsed in the early 1990s, you didn't have a better, more progressive system. You had gangster capitalism. In Russia, and the figures are similar for the Ukraine, average life expectancy fell by 10 years in the 1990s. Imagine how much poorer you've got to get for average life expectancy to fall by 10 years. So the majority suffered terribly, and a few people at the top, who now get called the oligarchs, took all the wealth and established themselves as this gangster capitalist class. And that was true both towards the ones that looked towards Eastern Russian capitalism and the ones that looked towards Western capitalism. All were just driven by maximising their own profit. Right now, inevitably, among people worldwide, there is a strong feeling we've got to do something to help the Ukrainian people. And, that's correct. We share that feeling. But it is cynically used by the capitalist elites to try and win support for their system. Here in the US and in Britain as well. I don't suppose you can hold Biden responsible for the actions of his son, but his son has certainly made a fair few millions, billions out of working with both Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs. And it is certainly true that Biden was pushing against any serious negotiations over the Donbass, over Donetsk and Luhansk before this war broke out. So he was not acting to prevent that war. In Britain, our Prime Minister was on the verge of being thrown out of power because they had, it is now legally accepted, they had 15 parties at the height of lockdown in the home of government while ordinary people couldn't visit their dying relatives during the pandemic. And then the Ukrainian war comes along and he cynically uses that to try and stay in power. That might have finished now because they've just had 50 of them have had police fines. So we'll see what happens. But it's utterly cynical because the Tory party, the government in Britain, have had money of 10 different Russian oligarchs in the last period. He actually, against the advice of the British security services, made one of those oligarchs
a member of our House of Lords, Lord Lebedev of Siberia, believe it or not, because they're so in bed with these Russian moneymakers. These people are crying crocodile tears when they say that they care about what is really happening in the Ukraine. It's the same on the question of the refugees. They say, oh, we must let in Ukrainian refugees. And that makes a lot of people angry when they know that refugees from Afghanistan, from Palestine, from many other countries in the world that are suffering in Britain are literally drowning in the Channel because they're not allowed into our country and they're trying to get there. But let's be clear, they're not letting Ukrainians in either. The British government has only let in 3,000 Ukrainian refugees at this point in time. We say every refugee, everybody fleeing war, should have the right to flee and to come somewhere safe to a country of their choice. But we also make an important point. Who should pay for that? Because usually it is the poorest working class communities, often migrants themselves, who have to house and look after and stretch their already stretched resources to look after people who come. Why not take the money from the super rich? In Britain, they've said that the government will seize the mansions of the Russian oligarchs, and London is stacked with empty mansions that are just investment for these oligarchs. We say, take the mansions of all of the oligarchs, including our own British version of oligarchs that are sitting there empty, and use them to house all of the refugees, as well as the homeless coming from in Britain itself. So working class people have nothing in common with these capitalist looters. Of course, we understand that if you're faced with an invasion and you're fighting for your life, as people are in Ukraine, then inevitably you look to another strong power to try and help you. So illusions that NATO is trying to help the Ukrainian people. But we would just say, we totally understand that, but ask working class people in Syria, in Afghanistan, ask the Kurds, ask the Palestinians. NATO, US imperialism, British imperialism, they treat the national rights of minorities like so much loose change, and they've trampled over them again and again. You cannot trust these people to fight in your interests. And actually, NATO's expansion eastwards has never been motivated by protecting democratic rights. It's about protecting the interests of Western capitalism. So we have to take an independent position. If the workers' movement wants to help, we do it as an independent workers' movement, as we should. And of course that means mass protests. It means fighting for the right of Ukrainian refugees to be allowed in. But more powerful is workers' action. And we have seen some instances of that. I think of longshoremen on the west coast refusing to unload ships. In Britain there have been dockers that have refused to unload ships with Russian oil and so on. And we'd say that's a different question to when capitalist governments introduce sanctions, which actually Putin can use the sanctions by capitalist governments to mobilise support behind his own regime. But when workers introduce them and make a class appeal to workers in Russia, that can have a much greater effect. Similarly, we understand that right now Zelensky has been hailed as a hero around the world and also in the Ukraine because it's in the face of a foreign invader. That's absolutely inevitable. But an independent class position does not mean following suit. Part of our job is to remember the reality. What existed before the war? Because Zelensky was elected promising, although he was always funded by oligarchs, but he was elected promising to deal with oligarchs and corruption. He was elected promising to give concessions to the oppressed ethnic Russian minority in the Ukraine, to negotiate an end to the war that's gone on since 2014, but he didn't do any of it. And it's not on the same scale as the carnage taking place now, but 15,000, mainly ethnic Russians, have died in that war in the east of Russia, in Donetsk and Luhansk, in the period since 2014. And he has presided over that, as well as introducing some of the most vicious anti-trade union laws in any supposedly democratic country. He was on 25% in the polls for that reason, as I may have just said, before the war took place. And we don't just put that aside. Because, again, what force has the power in Ukraine to cut across this war? When he's not attacking the Russians, the Russian people, Zelensky has also sometimes made appeals to them to overthrow Putin. But this man who has presided over the continued banning of the Russian language he's not going to be able to make any effective appeal to the Russian people. But the workers' movement in the Ukraine, to say to the Russian people, look, we support the right of self-determination. It should be for the people of Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea to decide for themselves whether they want to be aligned to Russia, whether they want to be independent, or whether they want to be part of the Ukraine. And we support the right of the Russian language and all other minority languages. But you get out of our country, you've been brought here under false pretences, you go deal with Putin and allow us to sort out our own problems. The workers' movement, I know it's not easy in a war, but that kind of appeal would have a real effect. So we cannot put aside those issues. We have to fight for an independent working class solution to this problem. And while that's not easy, building the workers' movement, building support for socialist ideas everywhere plays a really crucial role. There's a famous quote by a very famous socialist who stood out against the First World War in Germany, was the only person to vote as an MP against it, and he declared the main enemy is at home. And in a sense we all need to think that if we can build independent workers' parties that do not follow behind any of the big business parties, but fight for socialist internationalism, that stand in solidarity with working class people around the world, if we can do that in Britain, if you can do it in the US, for the Ukrainians, the Russians, that will put us in a much more powerful position to fight against future wars, but above all, to fight for a socialist society where we take power out of the hands of those major corporations and we run society democratically to meet the needs of all, based on planning, cooperation, looking after our environment, rather than the ruthless pursuit of profit, which unfortunately in this era is more and more going to lead to the kind of horrible wars that are taking place in Ukraine at the moment. So, I think